While you are sitting in your office at your desk or on your couch in your PJs, not mentioning any names, some of us were out traveling and learning. Don't worry, I'll catch you up on what you missed. Let's get to it. Welcome. Another fabulous episode of IBF On Demand. I'm your over-traveled and never-home host, Eric Wilson. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thanks for the follows and subscribes. I said you can actually find me on LinkedIn. I'm on YouTube. Actually, wherever you get your podcasts, those platforms, Apple, Spotify, we are there as well. So follow us on all of them if you would like. We have a sponsor, Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. So thank you, Arkiva, for being a continued sponsor and great organization. We have a lot of events coming up in 2025, so please check them out, ibf.org. It's going to have a complete listing, and as more come on, you're going to see them up there as well. So even if you visited once, come back, visit again. So ibf.org for complete events going on in 2025. And also follow me on LinkedIn. Once again, I'm going to be posting a lot of those events. So if you want to keep abreast of what's going on, you can follow me or IBF then as well. Recently, I was at the IBF Orlando flagship conference. And it was really great meeting a lot of you there. There's a lot of wonderful people, great speakers. A lot of people came up to me, mentioned that they, watched the podcast as well. I think at this point, I've probably met all 12 of my listeners out there. But the conference itself was an amazing 2.5 days. I mean, I always enjoy them. Day one of the event was a leadership forum. This is an exciting opportunity where we have great panels. That's really an executive type forum where we go over S&OP, demand, AI, technology, supply. We talk about these topics in 3 different panels. Great executives, thought leaders that are on the panels. I moderated them all. So I actually had the opportunity to moderate all 3 panels there, but with some fantastic discussions, always great insights, debates, and conversations. Well, today we have a fantastic guest that was actually on one of those panels. Someone was at the conference. He refers to himself as a supply chain nerd and has experience to back it up. Patrick Bauer, a lot of you already know, spent time in the supply chain world for 30-some years now. And I said he was at the leadership forum on one of the panels. And really, I wanted to be able to bring some of those insights that we talked about to you. The panel was establishing S&OP IBP as your organizational compass. But not everyone could make it to that panel. So I wanted to share a little bit of it with you. Now, the downside is you don't get to ask questions. In person, everyone asked questions. We had great dialogue. You don't get to ask the questions. Now, the positive or the good side is I moderated them. And I'm moderating this conversation as well, so you get a little bit of that then as well. You also get Pat, who was on the panel, who had some great insights. This is actually 2-part series. We had 3 executive streams, each had 15 panelists. What I'm doing over this podcast and the next is I'm going to bring 2 of those streams to you and 2 of those guests. The first guest is Patrick Bauer, a frequent writer and speaker, well recognized in the field as both S&OP and supply chain expert, award of excellence in business forecasting from IBF, along with countless other accolades and awards. Currently is the Senior Director of North American Supply Chain. Please help me welcome back Patrick Bauer. So welcome back, Pat. It's always exciting to have you. Saw you at the leadership and being able to come back and be able to share with this audience. It's always exciting to have you back on this podcast.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate being on the podcast. I love the conference. I feel like whenever I'm I'm with my fellow IBFers. It's my professional tribe. I'm sure you know what I mean.
I know exactly what you mean. It's the people that really keep me going back. I learn continuously learning from them, but just to being able to get among people that we share the same issues and pain, it's therapeutic at times to go to these conferences as well.
And even an aging veteran like myself goes to the conferences, and I come away with a different turn of phrase, a different way to explain something, a different graphical metaphor. It's always a learning experience, no matter how much time you spent in the profession.
Yeah. Well, I continue to learn from you as well, and everybody else did. We had a great panel, some great topics, and great discussions. And I wanted to bring a little bit of that discussion back here to the audience and have you an opportunity to kind of elaborate on some of the questions we heard in that leadership forum. I mean, so
That's
with
great.
that, jumping right into that first question, because we talked about S&OP, a lot of what we talked about was collaboration, cross-functional participation. That came up quite frequently. So with that, my first question then was, what were the key challenges you face in establishing cross-functional or collaboration in participation in an organization? What's some of the key challenges that organizations face?
It's always hard to get. One of the biggest challenges with S&OP is that it is cross-functional. You have constituent parties from all different organizations within your bigger, larger organization. You have finance, you have marketing, each of them, and sales, each of them with their own particular mindset and approach, their own agendas. So how do you get them all on the same page? A little bit of coaching them individually, and I like to take each leader of each group and take them aside and say, listen, here's what S&OP is. Here's how you get the benefit of it. The easiest example is with sales. So sales is always looking at how can I do the best job for my customer, and they're really demanding of the supply chain about delivering on time and full. If you sell anything in the consumer goods market space, OTIF and some variation of it is very much a key metric today. So how does S&OP help that? I'm forecasting the right inventory to put in the right place at the right time to meet consumer demand. So it's connecting the dots. It's adding value to the sales group by by making sure that we're delivering on time. And more importantly, we're delivering in full. S&OP helps enable that. So you're selling constantly to all these individual groups within the organization. How do you sell to finance? How do you pull them into the conversation? It's real easy. You have to report to outside analysts. You have to report to lenders if you're buying, especially for inventory on the short term. You have to report out to stock analysts if you're a public company. You're constantly reporting to someone if you're in finance. How does S&OP help them? It gives them more confidence in the numbers, particularly the top line and the bottom line if you happen to be doing it well. So I take everyone aside and I coach them. And I coach them up front. I essentially try and sell them up front. But then with each meeting, with each month that passes on, I'm going back to them and saying, here's what's important in this meeting. Here's what I'm observing. Here's what I'm hearing. I'm not sure if you've ever had anyone coach you inside of the process, or you've been around people that have done it before. It's a particularly effective tool. It doesn't take a lot of time, but it adds an awful lot of value up front. I used to, when I worked at Snapple, walk into the CEO's office. I had a mandatory meeting prior to my S&OP executive review, where I'd sit with him and I would talk through the issues, talk through the
Oh,
metrics that
wow.
were out of control.
Yeah.
I talked through where I saw disconnects between consumption and actual shipments. I talked to where I thought inventory was being overbuilt. I talked to him about any challenges that I saw from being a participant in all of the meetings.
Oh.
And he kind of didn't let anyone know. that we were having these conversations, and he'd walk into the meetings and he'd ask these really smart learning questions because I had fed the pipeline. I had fed his pipeline of questions prior. So I think you get cross-functional by being intentional about being cross-functional, and you try and help everyone in the process do their best and look their best, because no one wants to be surprised. No one wants to be caught out. No one wants to be made to look foolish. So the more that you can feed that dynamic, I think the better off the process will be in the end.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it exactly answers my
No.
problems with cross functionality. I've always tried to just avoid it by being as collaborative as I can possibly be.
Yeah, I like what you said there. I mean, the one thing you never want to hear in an S&OP process going in is, that's the first time I'm hearing about that. You never want to hear those words spoken in an S&OP process. You don't want the surprises.
And when I watched other people in the very early going, when I watched other people facilitate these meetings, I recognized that they always seem to be a battle or a fight. And I don't have any problem with organizational tension, but people coming out of meetings hating each other is never a good thing. So when I moved into a place where I was leading S&OP processes, I want to have full transparency, as much data, max transparency, max collaboration, and I want to be the person behind the scenes, just not pulling the strings, but helping to orchestrate the conversation so it was better. So.
Yeah, I mean, like it is about transparency. You're not trying to pull one over on somebody else or get your way. You're working collaboratively for the same objectives and goals, hopefully, and that's what really, I think, makes a stronger S&OP process.
And S&OP isn't about kumbaya moments. It's really not.
It's true.
And there's a certain amount of organizational tension that is really, really good. Like asking questions like, why are you forecasting a +10 when we've been trending at a -3? Those are legit questions. Mm-hmm. But if I can go to all the parties and say, you know what, we should be digging in a little bit more. Did we lose any customers? What's driving the -3? And why are you holding on to a +10? Having those conversations prior to the S&OP meetings themselves is actually really helpful. And people come to the meeting much more prepared. So pre-circulating content, coaching people, talking through all the main issues prior to the meetings actually happening, and so when people walk into the meeting, you've already built that transparent, collaborative culture. That's a win. It's always going to be a win.
I agree. And so it's about transparency, but I love what you talked about, is coaching. I love that word, because you're not just a champion or a cheerleader, and you're not managing the process. Coaching. I think coaching is really a great word for that. And you mentioned that CEO, and kind of going back to that, you talked about culture, putting those together. One of the questions we had in the leadership forum was, what roles does leadership play in fostering the culture, fostering accountability in the process? What role does the leadership play in that, and how do you build that culture?
Yeah, so leadership has to be more than just being in the room. They have to be engaged. So the coaching helps build some of that. But the leaders have to model the behavior. They have to be asking questions. They have to be actively listening to the answers, and not just throwing whatever dogma that they have in their head out onto the table. They have to listen to the real problems. They can't just say, "Well, I don't want to move off a plan," because that never results in a good S&OP outcome. So the best thing a leader can do, the best thing for S&OP any leader can say, is, I want a reality-based plan, because I want to be able to go to all of the stakeholders that he's responsible for, or she is responsible for, and say, here's what we're seeing, and here's why we're seeing it. And the S&OP process can be really enabling to a senior executive in doing just that.
Okay. one thing I wanted to get to too is you wrote a wonderful article. I love the article, and kind of I half jokingly say it was a rebuttal to the S&OP book, the Practical Guide to Sales and Operations book. That even though you had a couple chapters in that book, and thank you for the kind words on the book jacket, but you had a great article I wanted you to kind of highlight, which was the dangers of S&OP overreach, trying to be too much, trying to be too big, and too complex for people. And folding too many things in at once. Can you explain a little bit about that article and what do you mean by the process getting too complex?
Well, I was really kind of focusing the attention. The underlying premise is that you go to any conference, you look at any survey, look at anything that's being written about S&OP, and everyone feels like most S&OP processes are mid to low maturity. So why are we throwing curb scrapers and fuzzy dice onto the jalopy here? It makes absolutely no sense. So people want to throw risk management onto it. I get it, kind of, but risk management is kind of in it from a demand and supply perspective through scenario management. People want to put FP&A, and they want to make sort of S&OP the grand planning poobah of the organization. And it's like some of the components are already there. It should already have a connection to FP&A. It doesn't have to be FP&A. It doesn't have to lead that. It's not the leader process in planning inside of most organizations. It's just one of many planning processes. Every organization has multiple planning pillars. IT plans. They plan what they're going to do next year in terms of upgrading equipment and software. Marketing has brand plans and media plans and promotional plans. Sales has sales plans where they say, here's the key accounts that we want to go after or mature or increase distribution on. Everyone has plans. It doesn't mean that all of those have to be connected with S&OP. There are inputs from those planning processes into S&OP. Doesn't mean that S&OP rules the roost. And I think that's the big mistake. When people start calling it integrated business planning, it made it seem like it was this big. And it's still fundamentally, if it's being done well, supply and demand balancing with financial valuation on the back end. That's where you get the highest amount of value. That's where the eureka moments are. That's where the organization gets synergized and connected. I think if you start adding everything else onto it and saying we want it to be the modality, the ecosystem for all planning inside of the organization, I think that's a mistake. Again, going back to the fundamental premise, we're not even getting the simple part of it right. Why expand it? So.
And I mean, I'm full disclosure, I'm kind of guilty of that on occasion as well. It's the reason we have some great discussions and debates. But I think there's certain things we do align on as well. And I agree. If you don't have the fundamentals right, I mean, you get the car running before you start adding the accessories to it. It doesn't run better just because you added the accessories to it. You have to get the car running well. And I really love that analogy. If you don't have the fundamentals, you're not going to the next step. At the same time, if you have the fundamentals, then absolutely push your organization to do more and more. But I think the one thing we both align on is no matter how we're talking about that, it is truly a journey. And you're starting off at a certain, meeting the organization where it is, a certain elements, and you're building incremental steps and processes, and you need to do those fundamentally well before you start doing the next piece. I think that's where we align.
I agree, and I think you heard me talk about this prior, where I think everyone has to go back and look at where they are on some maturity matrix or grid, or I know IBF has one. There's hundreds of them. Just Google S&OP maturity, and you'll find something that feels right or works for you. Where am I now? What's my as-is place? And where do I want to go to? And what do I think the organization is really capable of? And then building a plan towards that, as opposed to imagining something this big you're boiling the ocean. Scale it back to something that's manageable. And maybe in 5 years or 10 years, you can do something more. But most companies, again, are at a very low level to mid-level of maturity. They're not capable of doing some of the things. Go try and staff it, frankly. It's going to be next to impossible to find that person that could actually do all of that work and understands all of that. So, again, I'm kind of an incrementalist in this. Figure out where you are, and then build a path forward from there. And recognize that every time the president of the company turns over, a CEO turns over, a CFO turns over, or a brand manager turns over, or a head of sales turns over, your maturity is going to take a dip because they have to come up to speed with the process that you've implemented. So it's, if you really look at S&OP, it has this goes, most processes tend to go up over time. They tend to get more and more mature
But
as
it's not
people
linear.
become more, but it's not. And there's a lot of hills and valleys inside of there, and you can have one person come in and destroy all the progress you made. I had this one senior vice president of marketing come in, and we started talking about a new product introduction. And it was a new product that required, buying an awful lot of material in front of it with a relatively short shelf life. And I'm just starting to ask about pipe bleed and pipe fill inside of this new product introduction. And she did one of these to me, like a talk to the hand moment. And in her best Fran Drescher voice, she's like, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And yet she caused the process to recede pretty significantly because she was all about showing the plan. Like, if you agree that the business was going to do $100 million in a year, she was going to hold to that $100 million. So forecast accuracy went out of control, inventory went out of control. We were adding overtime for a product that we were never going to use. Obsolete inventory went out of control because she gave me a talk to the hand moment.
Wow.
So
Yeah. Yeah. So when you talk about maturity models, they're roadmaps, but you have to start where you are and take that path. And you said it sounded like, I've heard you talk about it before. It seemed like only hours ago I heard you talk about that before. So when you're looking at the S&OP as most organizations' essential type of level, they're working on the blocking and tackling. They're working on balancing supply and demand. How, and this was another question we had in the leadership then as well, how does that evolve from a tactical process really to a strategic type process for an organization? How do you really elevate that to the strategy or connect to the strategy?
Well, the simplest way is to think strategically. I think making S&OP strategic lies in the mind and eyes and hands of the S&OP lead. So how do you make it a little bit more strategic if you feel it's tactical? And make sure you're working the depth of horizon. Make sure the metrics you use are strategic metrics. Make sure you're adding financial evaluation to it. Make sure you have the right level senior executives in the room. But really understanding what the strategy of the business is and how that fits into the supply and demand balancing model. If I know that a strategy of the business is to grow new product introductions to 20% of total volume, you better believe I'm putting that metric in my executive review. And you better believe I'm asking questions around the new product forecast in the demand review. And I'm really keen in looking at what's happening in the portfolio review to make sure that new products are coming down the pipeline uninhibited and debottlenecking new product introductions there. So again, knowing what the strategy is kind of resides in the mind and the eyes and the hands of the S&OP lead, and they take it to the meeting. They bring it to the meeting. So the person most responsible for making it less tactical and more strategic is the lead.
Yeah. And I've heard you say this before, time before, but you mentioned just having the CEO in the room doesn't necessarily make it strategic either, though.
No, and you can bore the tears out of a CEO if all you do is have a reporting out session that's very tactical. That's this month and last month,
Now, some
and
people, they get into it. During COVID, they already got into those tactical war room type of things.
absolutely. And I think that was one of the blessings and curses of what happened with COVID is that. CEOs and senior executives got to sit through essentially master planning sessions during COVID. So they got to see how the sausage is made, um, and for good or for bad. That shows all the challenges that the everyday supply chain planner or demand planner has to face inside of doing their job. Things that we know about, but they weren't necessarily exposed to. And we've gotten much more, the world has become much more disruptive in VUCA over time. So, uh, you know, even if they had some exposure to it 15 years ago or 10 years ago, it's just, frankly, just not the same anymore. So the challenge is now they've been there, now they want to be part and overweight every single little decision that are made, and they don't know to wait a little bit. So, during COVID, I watched senior executives do things like just order 6 months of supply. So it's no surprise to me that you know the supply chain pundits out there sort of talked about a destocking of the supply chain for 6 months to a year because people ordered up like crazy, creating this enormous bullwhip inside of the supply chain, which cascaded and cascaded and cascaded. And it took until sometime mid 22 to start really addressing the issue of overstocking inside the supply chain. It's been bleeding down ever since. There's still some industries that are way over inventoried at this point in time.
Yeah, there's still companies feeling the pain. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
it was great having you on. It was always great. I mean, there was a whole lot of other questions we couldn't get to, but hopefully this inspired people to come to the next leadership forum and see you in person and hear these and be able to ask questions of you as well. So, but I really appreciate you being on this. It's always a pleasure.
Eric, thank you very much. The IBF conferences are so much fun for me. I always go in and I always learn something, and at the risk of repeating myself, an old hand like myself can go in and learn at these conferences. And whether it's just how someone, just a graphical metaphor or turn of phrase, those are eureka moments for me personally. So
You
anyway,
can
thank
still
you for
keep.
inviting me.
Oh, no problem. You can still teach these old dogs new tricks.
Something
I'm
like
including
that.
myself in that, Pat. Don't
That's
worry.
it's okay. I relish being an old dog sometimes. So
I'm right there with you, Pat. I'm right there with you. So, all right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to see you, I'm sure, at a future conference.
thanks, Eric.
All righty. Bye. So, one of the key takeaways for me in this was really the coaching transparency. I loved that discussion. We really talked about the role of an S&OP champion or the person really helping design and run an S&OP process is not just a champion, but a coach that works both directions, that works really with the practitioners and the people in the meeting, but also the executives, and builds and strengthens that culture of transparency in the organization as well. I love those insights, and I love that word coach, and I'm going to really utilize that going forward because I love that terminology. The other thing I picked up on that was the simplicity of S&OP. Meeting the organization where it's at, not overcomplicating things, not leading the layers and layers of complexity if you're not ready for them. I mean, I'm guilty of this as well, of really preaching the S&OP can be all things to everyone. Now, with that, I hope you don't take away that message that you start there. This is truly a journey, and you go from the emerging to the essential to the next level to the vanguard. And there's a lot of organizations still at the essential. And I truly believe what Pat was talking about, I'm on board with as well, is if you're not a solid essential, if you don't have the fundamentals down, you don't start pushing yourself to the next level in vanguard yet. there is opportunity for growth, and you want to keep pushing yourself, but you have to shore up where you are first. And I think he did a great job pointing that out, and it's something we both agree on. You focus on the essentials, ensure cross-functional collaboration, keeping the process aligned with the broader organizational goals. Avoid turning S&OP into something that tries to solve every problem. Solve your problems first, meet the organization where it's at, and then bring on more and more complexity as you have the people and process to absorb it. Ultimately, though, you want to focus on collaboration, consensus, and transparency. Well, that's a wrap. I'm going to go jump on another plane and travel somewhere, or maybe just record another podcast while I'm here. My name is Eric. You can find me at eric@ibf.org. That's eric@ibf.org. Thanks for Arkiva, driving business transformation by solving what others cannot. Thank you, Arkiva. I hope you can come out to another conference. There's a lot of great advantages. Pat talked about that, practitioner tribe. And I mean, it truly is. There's great people, wonderful network, great opportunity for sharing ideas, learning, advancing. That really is the heart and soul of IBF. Learn, share, advance. And this conference and other conferences IBF has really embodies that. So it's not only good for your career, but it's good for the field as well. So I hope you check out IBF.org. I hope you consider coming out to a conference. I see you at a future conference then as well. And remember, if you do go to a conference, shaking all those hands and networking, don't forget, wash your hands.